I'd like to call the hearing to order this morning, and certainly want to thank the witnesses for being with us today. This morning we do begin a new hearing series entitled Benefits of and Challenges to Energy Access in the 21st Century. And today's hearing will focus on electricity access. And the next hearing will deal with fuel supply and infrastructure issues. Now, when we talk about access to electricity, in America we are fortunate that we have a well-developed system. But many of us are genuinely concerned that the Obama administration is pushing us so quickly, so fast, into a renewable mode, and the President says that he supports an all-of-the-above energy policy, which all of us do support. But his actions indicate that certainly on coal, he does not see that coal really has a future in America, despite what he might say. And most people recognize, I think, that Europe at least has the reputation of being the green sector of the world. And 22% of their electricity comes from renewables. But we also know that they're having great difficulty. They have an unemployment rate of 12%. Gas prices are so high that they mothballed 30 gigawatts of natural gas-powered plants to produce electricity. And last year, they imported into their area about 50% of our coal export market. And they're using more coal because natural gas prices are too high. And I think realistically in America, we don't think anyone's going to build a new coal-fired plant with natural gas prices as low as they are. But most of us genuinely believe that we should have the option to build a coal-fired plant in the future. And with the greenhouse gas regulations that will become final supposedly this summer, it will be impossible to build a new coal-fired plant because the technology is not available to meet the emission standards set by EPA. And we feel very strongly and have written letters to EPA asking for an explanation that their emission standard was set illegally because the plants that they rely on is an explicit violation of the 2005 Energy Policy Act. So, and I think that this recent cold spell should also cause concern for all of us. AEP announced, the CEO of AEP announced that 89% of their plants in operation to meet this cold spell demand will be retired, scheduled to be retired in 2015. Southern Company, 75% of their plants, coal plants operating at capacity for this recent cold spell, plan to be retired. Lumina brought 2 coal-fired plants back into operation in Texas for this cold spell. TVA set an electricity demand record during this cold spell, and they're planning to close 20 coal-fired plants. The nuclear companies have written us letters saying that the pending cooling tower regulation coming out of EPA threatens the premature shutdown of significant number of nuclear power plants. So on the one hand, you talk to people and they said, well, climate change is the #1 issue, and that's got to be addressed. On the other hand, if people's reliability are threatened, and if we can't compete in the global marketplace because we're eliminating one source of fuel that we might be able to use in the future, then we're threatening jobs and economy. But one of the most disturbing things from my perspective is that the Obama administration is being so aggressive in making sure that the World Bank And even they attempted the Exim Bank and the Asian Development Bank and other financial institutions will not provide funding for a coal plant to be built anywhere in the world. And we have people from Bangladesh coming and talk to us, people from Africa. I was reading in Nigeria, half of the people there don't even have electricity. So this administration, not only are their regulations affecting us domestically, but they are affirmatively, aggressively trying to prevent the building of a new coal-powered plant, even with the best technology anywhere in the world, even though in those areas what they're burning now is fuel oil using generators that is much dirtier than emissions from a supercritical coal plant, for example. So these are issues that we are struggling with, and they've got to be answered. We can't just run off, as John Kerry said recently in Indonesia, that climate change is the mass destruction weapon facing mankind. I think that kind of extreme view is not good or healthy. My time's expired, and I was just getting started. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for an opening statement.
Well, I thank the Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for coming out here today, despite the weather and whatever obstacles you may have had. I just want to say a little rebuttal to to the Chairman, who I have great respect for. But coal does have a future in this country, but we need to implement carbon capture and sequestration technology and develop that technology, which would be a benefit to the coal industry. That being said, electricity and energy production and our environment are interconnected, and it's essential that we continue efforts to produce energy in a responsible way. We know, as has been confirmed by the world's leading scientists, that climate change is happening and that human activities, including burning fossil fuels, are driving this change. We've also seen that climate change threatens our electricity system itself and our economy through impacts like droughts, like the one we're now having in California, where water accounts for about 15% of our total power supply. This drought has disrupted hydroelectric dams and forced utility companies to purchase electricity from other sources that is up to 3 times more expensive than hydro. Severe weather events, disasters, polar vortices, and large wildfires also pose additional strains to our electricity system. As a result, when considering electricity access in the coming years, we must consider climate change. Energy efficiency, demand response, grid resiliency, reliability measures, and modernization could all help to mitigate and prepare for the climate impacts that scientists tell us are coming. Addressing electric grid enhancements and vulnerabilities will that providers are more capable of preparing for and responding to our energy needs during extreme weather events, and also boost our economy by creating manufacturing jobs and encouraging innovation. Our nation generates electricity from a variety of sources. 39% comes from coal, 29% from natural gas, 19% from nuclear, and 13% from renewable sources. Renewable energy capacity alone has surpassed 90 gigawatts and is becoming more competitive with fossil fuels every year. In this committee, we've talked about American efforts to curb carbon pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and how that parallels the energy policies of other nations. The U.S. should lead by example. We can show other countries that we are more environmentally responsible to meet our energy needs. Coal will remain a component of our nation's energy infrastructure, but we can show that there are ways to make it cleaner. For example, there will be plants online this year, both in the United States and Canada, with CCS technology will significantly reduce coal's carbon pollution. We're also seeing the potential benefits of microgrids, where consumers may be better able to handle energy needs when wildfires take down a power line, and the microgrid system can provide additional power back to the utility. The International Energy Agency estimates that by 2020, developing countries will double their electricity power output. There will be regions where new centralized power plants make sense economically and is appropriate for existing infrastructure. However, Microgrids could and should be essential to bringing power to many developing regions. That's because connecting to a remote community to the conventional power grid with its large centralized power plants is expensive and can take more than a decade. Building and combining power from multiple local sources can be cheaper, more secure, and faster than extending the grid to remote areas. This type of
with a Tria hair removal laser.
The FDA-cleared Tria hair removal laser will give you a lifetime of smooth skin for a price anyone can afford.
The hair's gone. That's it. It doesn't grow back.
No more shaving, no more waxing. Done.
Only Tria offers an FDA-cleared laser for home use. This is a real laser, the same laser used by professionals. The laser targets each...
Make a statement. I know that members of Congress always like to speak, so... But I guess... Oh, I saw Mr. Waxman come in, so I was trying to stress that someone talk on our side. But this time I recognize Mr. Waxman for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of the opening statement makers, I want to say we're having a hearing on electricity access. Access to affordable, reliable electricity is fundamental to our economy. It is a subject we should be working together to address, especially since much of our current electricity infrastructure is decades old and will need to be replaced or upgraded in the coming years. According to the Edison Foundation, these investments will cost over $1 trillion over the next 2 decades. But we can't have an honest discussion about the future of electricity system unless we talk about climate change. Until we have an energy policy that acknowledges the reality of climate change, the utility industry will operate in a perpetual state of uncertainty. Outside of Congress, there is broad agreement that climate change is the most significant issue facing our energy systems and infrastructure needs. On Monday, the CEO of the nation's largest railroad, Matthew Rose, called for an energy policy that recognizes the reality of climate change. On Tuesday, David Crane, the CEO of the nation's second-largest power generator, said that climate change is the most serious threat to the future of the world. These CEOs operate in the real world, so unlike this committee, they know the value of listening to scientists. And scientists know that climate change is occurring and that human activities such as burning fossil fuels are largely responsible. The most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which assessed nearly 10,000 peer-reviewed studies, concludes that, quote, warming in the climate system is unequivocal, end quote, and, quote, human influence on the climate system is clear, end quote. And just yesterday, the Royal Society in the United Kingdom and our own National Academy of Sciences jointly briefed this committee to reiterate that it is now more certain than ever that humans are changing Earth's climate and that these changes will have serious impacts on human societies and the natural world. Energy, economic prosperity, and the climate are intertwined. The rest of the world knows this. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon calls climate change an existential threat. And World Bank President Jim Yong Kim said that unless we address the climate change, quote, we could witness the rolling back of decades of development gains and force tens of millions more to live in poverty, end quote. And President Kim said point blankly, quote, if we don't confront climate change, we won't end poverty, end quote. We need to face this reality if we're going to design an energy policy that protects our environment, grows our economy, and gives companies the certainty they need. Electricity system investments cost hundreds of millions and often billions of dollars and are expected to last for decades. It makes no sense to build this infrastructure without considering its effects on the climate and the effects of climate change on our energy systems. Much of American industry knows this. Even ExxonMobil screens investments using a price on carbon of $60 per ton. Most other major oil companies assume carbon prices as well. Walmart, Wells Fargo, Delta, GE, Google, DuPont, all are using a price on carbon to guide their decisions. As we'll hear from one of our witnesses today, Synapse, even utility companies are assuming carbon prices in their planning. According to a recent survey, quote, carbon pricing has been standard operating practice in business planning, end quote. But it is still anathema even to discuss the idea in this committee. We need to stop denying science and start listening to the scientists and enlightened business leaders if we're going to succeed in crafting a sustainable energy policy for the future. For the information of our witnesses and our guests at this hearing today, despite repeated requests to have a hearing with scientists, we haven't even gotten a response to that request, let alone a hearing. So we have a willful ignorance in this committee of the reality of what's happening in the world today as we look at energy policy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman, and that concludes our opening statements. And so once again, I want to welcome the witnesses and thank you for being with us today. We have a distinguished group of panelists that will provide great insights into this issue that we're talking about, energy access and the benefits and challenges of that. Our first witness this morning, and I'll introduce all of you and then we'll go back, but we're delighted to have Mr. Edward Finley, who's the chairman of the North Carolina Utilities Commission. Mr. Finley, thank you for being with us. We have Mr. Bruce Bywald, who's the chief executive officer of Synapse Energy Economics. We have Mr. Mel Coleman, who's the chief executive officer of the Northern Arkansas Electric Co-op. We have Mr. Paul O'Brien, who's the vice president for policy and campaigns at Oxfam America. And then we have Dr. Todd Moss, who's the chief operating officer and senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. So thank all of you for being with us, and each of you will be given 5 minutes for your opening statement, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, Mr. Finley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member McNerney.
Is your microphone on? Maybe.
I believe it is.
Maybe get a little closer.
Right. The green button is on. So, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to share with you my thoughts on the importance of affordable and reliable electricity in North Carolina. By far the most difficult aspect of my job is to conduct public hearings at which consumers appear and implore us commissioners to reject utility requests to raise rates. The testimony often is poignant and heart-rending. If you approve this request, I will be unable to pay both the power bill and to pay for the medicine that I need. We listen to testimony for hours at a time in hearings from one end of our state to the other. In the end, we nevertheless grant at least a percentage of the requested increases because the utilities must maintain their financial health to provide reasonably priced electricity over the long term and maintain reliable and safe service. Electric utility rates increases in recent years have been driven primarily by plant construction expenses, a new supercritical coal plant to replace older, less efficient ones, new gas plants constructed for the same reasons. More stringent environmental regulations have been a major catalyst. Our state, its legislature, the electric and gas utilities, and its regulators have acted responsibly in efforts to improve the environment while minimizing financial hardship on the state's citizens that have been hit hard by the recession. Since 2002, we have spent billions in environmental control facilities, coal to gas conversion, incentives for renewables, demand response, and energy efficiency measures. By 2015, our electric utilities will have retired all of their uncontrolled coal plants. However, rules requiring removal of carbon from the remaining smokestacks will prove a challenge for us. We have no place for the repositories. In 2007, the legislature enacted the first renewable energy portfolio standard in the Southeast. It calls for 12.5% of the electric sales to be from renewables and energy efficiency by 2021. For Duke Energy, demand-side management and energy efficiency is projected to meet 1/3 of the projected demand growth over the next 15 years. and for Progress Energy, 20%. We have followed in all of the above policy, seeking as best we have been able to balance the requirements to keep energy prices affordable while anticipating, assisting to formulate and to comply with the rules to protect and improve the environment. We believe this approach is best. It's usually done in an adversarial context where we hear strong arguments from both sides. That seems to be how energy policy is addressed these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Finley, and Mr. Bywald, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Whitfield, members of the U.S. Subcommittee on Energy and Power. My name is Bruce Bywald. I'm President and CEO of Synapse Energy Economics. We're a research and consulting firm specializing in electricity, energy, economic, environmental topics. We do work largely in the states before commissions, such as North Carolina, related to utility planning. So, I believe that climate change and carbon emissions from the electric sector can be addressed in the U.S. without threatening reliability, without large electricity price bill increases to customers, and in a way that creates net jobs in our economy. I'm here today to focus in particular on the planning practices in the states. Many utilities are placing dollar values on CO2. Carbon dioxide emissions are priced in utility planning processes in the states. It's become increasingly commonplace. So that's what I'm focused on. I did a report in November 2013, which is online. I think it's actually attached to my comments here. And it reviews federal and state policies related to CO2 and then summarizes utility forecasts of CO2 prices. So electric utilities, they're making very important resource decisions, very capital-intensive, long-lived resource decisions. And as part of that, they present the basis for those decisions before regulatory commissions in the states. They forecast CO2 prices, they forecast fossil fuel prices, they forecast capital costs for their resource alternatives. So I have a slide here today. Unfortunately, it's difficult to see, but it's at this scale. But it summarizes 30-some forecasts of CO2 prices by utilities. So we've got, for example, Duke Energy in the Carolinas as a forecast, I think in the middle of the pack. There, we've got Entergy in Arkansas. In their planning, they use 4 CO2 price forecast. Well, they use 0 for certain cases. They also look at a price of $25 per ton in 2017 in one of the sets of scenarios that they look at. So Entergy has a carbon price in their forecasts. In Arkansas, the Electric Cooperative Corporation has a CO2 price of they look at $0, $10, and $20 for purposes of the latest plan. So utilities around the country, including represented here, are through their regulators or executives, are forecasting CO2 prices and planning on that basis. They're able to do this, and the average of the prices shown there for 2025 is $16 per short ton of CO2. So that's kind of a summary of a lot of complicated information. The sources and the links to all the IRPs are provided in the appendix to my written submission here. So I want to say that there are carbon prices, I think, coming in the future in the United States that affect power plants. Utilities are recognizing that. They're able to recognize that and plan to serve their customers reliably at reasonable cost and to the benefit of the local and U.S. Total economies. Energy efficiency is available. Utilities that are investing in energy efficiency are seeing prices of 2 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. It's extremely attractive. In much of the country, particularly the middle, from the Dakotas down to Texas, wind energy last year was coming in at the prices of 2 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. In contrast, natural gas generation, all in is 6 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour, and the coal-fired power plants that we've been discussing, whether they are existing coal-fired power plants with the upgrades that are required, are at prices significantly above that, typically. It varies by region, it varies by plant. It's important for utilities and regulators and others to roll up their sleeves, look at the details, and make sound long-term planning decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Coleman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the Energy and Power Subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on the benefits and challenges to electric energy access in the 21st century. I am Mel Coleman. I am here only as CEO of North Arkansas Electric Cooperative, and my main concern are my 35,000 accounts that I have. We strive each and every day to improve the quality of life. That's the business we're in. We have 28,000 members, 35,000 connects. We purchase our power from Arkansas Electric Cooperative Corporation, which is our cooperatively owned wholesale power supplier. We have an obligation, Mr. Chairman, to provide a reliable supply of electricity, plain and simply, providing that to our member consumers at the lowest possible price. This job is not easy today based on the new and ongoing challenges that we face. One such challenge is the heavy infrastructure investment that's associated with serving in rural service territories. Co-ops serve very diverse communities with sharp economic and geographical differences, with service territories that are sparsely populated. I have a density, sir, of 7.4 meters per mile, where the average across the United States is 33.3. So our costs are a lot more than most co-ops and most utilities will see. The legacy of rural electrification and the obligation to serve the last mile results in higher maintenance costs as compared to our industry counterparts. On top of our infrastructure challenge, we serve some of the neediest Arkansans. As with most rural areas, North Arkansas is economically depressed with limited economic opportunities for our members. All 6 counties that my co-op serves has an average poverty rate of 19.15%, well above the national average, and a median household income of $32,000, well below the national average. Rural consumers are more dependent upon electricity to meet their household energy needs than those living in urban and suburban households. Contributing factors are higher electric usage in rural areas and the prevalence of single-family detached unit homes, as well as energy-inefficient manufactured housing. So it stands to reason that increased electricity costs have a disproportionate impact on rural consumers. Recently, consumers have been hit with the double whammy of increased cost and higher rates due to the recent cold snap. Not even a southern state like Arkansas was immune. Our electric co-ops set new peaks for winter power consumption, with this being the coldest winter the state has experienced in 20 years. High demand for electricity and natural gas, along with localized gas supply disruptions, forced the grid to rely heavily on coal generation to meet the power needs this winter. I hope we can all take a lesson from these events and appreciate the stability of coal pricing as a hedge against natural gas price volatility. Our coal-based generation resources protected Arkansas's electric cooperative member consumers from the full effect of the recent spike in natural gas prices. This winter proves that such a move to shut down coal plants, and EPA's goal of shutting down coal plants, would jeopardize reliable and affordable electricity for my members. Unfortunately, EPA's proposed standard to limit carbon dioxide emissions from new coal units will require carbon dioxide capture technology that is costly and is not viable on a commercial scale, effectively removing new coal generation as a hedge against future natural gas price spikes. EPA's climate regulations may well be the greatest threat facing our industry. We are extremely concerned that EPA will propose a standard to existing coal plants this summer that will threaten the viability of our existing coal fleet, resulting in increased costs to our members and undermine the reliability of the nation's power grid. My cooperative, members of the committee, is not in the electric business. We are in the life improvement business. Our partnership with NRECA's international program has only confirmed my sentiments about our commitment to quality of life. To see what rural America was like before rural electrification, all you need to do is visit a third world country. I hear old-timers talk about the day the lights came on, but I didn't experience that day. I was fortunate to be part of an electrification project in the remote areas of northwest Guatemala. Last year, I saw the lights come on for the first time for people. As the electrons flowed for the first time, so did the tears of all who witnessed. That was the beginning of a new quality of life for those villagers, and in their face, I saw our grandparents and felt what they experienced in our country 75 years ago. That's what we have to protect. Electricity is the foundation of our quality of life, and we must never forget that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Coleman. And Mr. O'Brien, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Ranking Member McNerney, for your comments and for inviting us here. Oxfam America is part of a collaboration of 17 affiliates, and we work in 90 countries around the world, kind of in the same business as Mr. Coleman, trying to improve lives. And those are touching reflections, and we've experienced those ourselves. We see energy poverty and what it means to people on the ground all over the world where we work. I lived in Afghanistan for 5 years, and I saw the same thing. I saw micro hydro dams turn on electricity for girls who were able to do schoolwork for the first time. In Sudan, I saw pumps that electricity was allowing water to come out. Women no longer had to walk through insecure areas. It literally changed their lives, may have saved them. East Africa, in more remote areas, I saw what refrigerated electricity can do for the medicines that rural communities in remote places can have, and health clinics work all day long. But we've seen something else happening in the last few years that we are also trying to work on the ground, and that is the devastating impacts of climate change for poor communities. We feel that they are the ones who face it first and worst. They are 20 times more likely to face a climate disaster in their lifetimes than the non-poor. So what has that meant for us? Well, it means two big things. One, it means that we as Oxfam have to spend a lot more time trying to help people be food secure in an increasingly insecure environment. We work in places like Mali, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Senegal to help farmers develop resilience practices so that they can cope with unpredictable weather. We've watched in the last few years food price spikes, and of course these are far worse for poor people because they're spending 70% of their income on food. So corn may not be at an all-time high now, but it was just a couple of years ago, and our estimates and our research tells us that corn is going to double in cost in real terms over the next 20 years due to climate change. The other big thing we see besides food insecurity is climate-related disasters. We've worked with victims of flooding in places like Pakistan and Bangladesh. We've helped communities recover from coastal incursions by extreme weather in the Gulf Coast of the United States, in Haiti, and very recently in the Philippines. In the next 40 years, we estimate that somewhere between 150 million and 1 billion people are going to be displaced by climate change. The US is already one of the most generous and effective responders to disasters around the world. But are we going to be able to cope? Already today, we're dealing with South Sudan, Syria, the Philippines, the Central African Republic. What are we going to do when climate exacerbates the breadth and depth of the disasters that we face? And this isn't just about the people on the ground that Oxfam America and others like us care about. It's also about all of the security and political unrest that comes when you face those kinds of disasters. What are we going to do? Something different must be done to deal with these two challenges of energy poverty, which is real on the one hand, as we've spoken about, but also of climate-related poverty. And just to be clear, Oxfam America does not oppose fossil fuel extraction. We worked for 10 years to make sure that the monies from oil, minerals, and gas that developing countries are getting, and they are getting it, goes towards poverty reduction. I just want to put this in numerical context. Globally, there's about $130 billion spent every year on aid to help people living in poverty, mostly in developing countries. At the same time, there's $2 trillion of private investment going into developing countries. And there's $6 trillion of government investment being spent in developing countries. The question that is before us is not whether we should decide the fate of fossil fuel industries in Africa and other places. That's going to happen anyway. The question is whether we should be taking precious US payer tax dollars and using it to invest in fossil fuels. And we believe that that's not the way forward if the interests of the poor in those countries is at the center of the equation. So today, the Electrify Africa Act is being marked up by the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And we, Oxfam, and many organizations like us are advocating that the Act adhere to 3 core principles around access. First, it should be prioritizing access and not just production. Secondly, let's remember that in the end of the day, whether communities and countries have viable access to electricity is going to be the responsibility of their own governments. And everything we should do should weaken, not undermine those governments. Whether we like it or not, they're going to be responsible for maintenance and for ensuring that revenues are connected to sustain their energy economies. And finally, we believe that the Act should be prioritizing renewable energy development. And just a couple of quick comments on why. First, we believe that fossil fuel do not internalize the actual cost of their production. Their cost to communities, their cost to countries, their cost to the planet. If they did, we believe that they are actually far more expensive than renewable energies. Secondly, we know where the poor are living. And although some will say that the numbers around urban poor are high, maybe as high as 200 million, we don't think it's that high. Even in a place like Africa, most people, 400 million, are living in rural areas where you cannot access them with centralized grid planning. You need mini-grids, you need off-grid plans. I watched in Afghanistan in the
Mr. O'Brien, excuse me, I've let you go over 1 minute and 15 seconds, so if you just summarize.
I will close with one sentence. Renewable energy costs, we believe they're going down, and we'd like more creativity and innovation by the United States. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me the time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Moss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and other members of the subcommittee. Energy access is increasingly relevant to American business and U.S. foreign policy interests, especially in the fast-growing emerging markets. As a development policy scholar at the Nonpartisan Center for Global Development and a former State Department official, I'm going to focus this morning on the international dimensions and what the U.S. should really, what can and should be doing about it. I have 3 points this morning. 1, the energy gaps are huge and very harmful. 2nd, the U.S. can and should be a leader in expanding energy access abroad. And 3, to succeed, we have to be honest about how our policy choices may have the practical effect of denying power to the world's poorest. First, more than 1 billion people today live without electricity. Turning on a light, heating our homes, using a computer or a fridge are things that we in the United States view as simple conveniences of modern life. In Africa, as we've heard, some 600 million people, almost twice the population of the United States, live with no electricity at all. Even those with access to power use an absolute fraction of the power that we do. I was recently shopping for a new refrigerator with my son, who's here with me today, and I was reading those little yellow Energy Star tags. And my new fridge uses 5 times more power per year than the average person in Tanzania or Liberia. This lack of electricity is devastating to both lives and to livelihoods. Without electricity, people are forced to cook with wood and charcoal. This creates indoor air pollution, which then leads to premature death. The best global estimate we have is that there are 3.5 million premature deaths every year from indoor air pollution. So energy poverty kills more people than AIDS and malaria combined. The effect on jobs and economic growth is stifling. World Bank data show that the lack of affordable and reliable electricity is the top constraint to business expansion in Africa. Second point, the U.S. government has a very vital role to play in closing this energy gap. African governments are prioritizing electricity investment. European countries, China, and other nations are increasing their commitment to energy access, and it's time for the U.S. to play its part too. In our own history, our government has been fundamental in the expansion of electricity to underserved areas and ensuring that American industry has sufficient and affordable energy to be competitive. This policy had both a human face and was pro-growth. Last June, President Obama launched Power Africa. This very promising initiative supports a doubling of energy access in the continent. Unfortunately, the agency best positioned to lead this effort, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC, is hamstrung by outdated policies and legislation. This little-known but high-performing agency supports the American private sector through insurance and project finance. Not aid, this is commercial finance. And what OPIC needs is not more money, but they need more authorities and flexibility to fulfill their mission. Fortunately, the Electrify Africa Act, introduced last year by House Committee on Foreign Affairs Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, is being marked up today. Congressional action is important because it will empower OPIC and provide a foundation so these efforts outlive the current administration. Momentum in Congress is encouraging, yet just as the U.S. is pushing expanded access, other policies are adding restrictions on financing for natural gas and even hydropower. This comes, unfortunately, at just the moment when many African countries are discovering natural gas, and understandably, they want to use some of those resources to produce electricity at home. Indeed, all 6 of the Power Africa focus countries are either producing or exploring for oil and gas today. Ghana, a close U.S. ally, is a good example. Ghana wants to use its newly discovered natural gas to expand access and grow its industry. Yet the U.S. is limited in our ability to assist them, and many advocacy groups concerned about greenhouse gas emissions are pushing to prevent any new gas-fired power plants in Ghana. As we consider our position, it's worth noting in the United States, we have more than 3,400 fossil fuel plants. Ghana has 2. My final point is that we cannot wish away these trade-offs of our energy policy choices. An emphasis on clean technology is a very good idea where it's feasible, and it deserves active U.S. support. But the scale of the problem is so great that those approaches will simply not be enough. People living without power are not all in isolated villages. As we've heard from Mr. O'Brien, some 200 million Africans living without electricity are in cities and towns. Connecting these fast-growing urban areas will require more large-scale generation and expanding the grid. Even in rural areas in Africa, people are not as spread out as some people imagine. In Kenya, only 20% of the population has access to power, but a careful study by the University of California, Berkeley, shows that 75% of the population lives within a mile of an existing transmission line. Solar lamps, also very, very popular, it's a fine invention, but consumer demand is going to be much greater than having a single light bulb and a cell phone charger. No country would rationally accept solar lamps in lieu of a modern energy system that can generate jobs and growth. A final common mistake is assuming that universal energy access can be achieved entirely through renewables. Instead, there is a clear trade-off between strictly focusing on renewables and expanding access. My colleague Ben Leo and I estimate that allowing OPIC to invest in natural gas power projects could provide, for the exact same money, access for 60 million more people over a renewables-only strategy. At the very least, we should make an exception to any public financing restrictions for the poorest countries with the least emissions. To conclude, no one would openly argue that we should fight climate change on the back of the world's poor, but we must be very careful not to burden the poorest nations with romantic notions of an energy future that does not yet exist. If an all-of-the-above approach is good enough for the United States, how can we in good conscience stand in the way of the world's poorest countries using locally available energy sources to provide electricity for their own people? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Moss, and thank all of you for your testimony. You know, your testimony raised some great issues because while we do have many problems in America as we make this transition, and I still maintain we're transitioning too quickly to renewables, but basically you have America and Europeans and wealthy nations dictating to developing nations on exactly what kind of energy they're going to have. And of course, Mr. O'Brien, in your testimony, I mean, Oxfam has a great reputation. Your testimony, you talked a lot about climate change, and obviously whenever you talk about this issue, you've got to talk about climate change. And I want to read an article that I read just recently about the most recent AR5 assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which says it acknowledged that the lack of warming since 1998, there's been a lack of warming since 1998, and there are growing discrepancies between observations in reality and the climate model projections. There's evidence of decreased climate sensitivity to increases in atmospheric CO2 concentrations. Evidence that the sea level rise during 1920 to 1950 was the same as 1998 to 2012, and that the Antarctic ice mass is increasing. Also, the types of weather extremes were worse in the 30s and even in the 50s than they are today. And there are a large group of scientists who are saying because so much of CO2 emissions are natural, that's having much more greater impact certainly than man-made. But so none of us question the concern about greenhouse gas enhanced climate change. But we should not be such alarmists, in the international news media, I think, is contributing to this, because we need to start acknowledging that there are some real discrepancies in these model projections and the reality, as is pointed out in this AR5 assessment report that was issued in the fall by the IPCC. So here we are talking about, we've got these financial institutions under pressure from the Obama administration dictating on what the electricity is going to be produced from in these developing countries. And, I mean, that's a concern that you expressed also, Dr. Moss. But anyway, one question I wanted to ask you, Mr. Coleman, I mentioned in my opening statement about how with this cold spell that we had, and we had Southern Company, we had AEP, we had Luminant, we had even the nuclear plants talking about the impact of these regulations, and 89% of the AEP coal fleet's going to go down. Southern Company, 75% that was operating at capacity is going to go down, all because of these regulations. And many of us are concerned about when you have spells like this, the renewables. I mean, how can you just meet your requirements with reliability without these plants? Would you just comment on that for me?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think the short answer is we can't. Baseload generation are our fossil fuel plants, and I'll give you a disclaimer. I'm in the distribution business. I'm not a generation and transmission expert, but the power that we purchase, we have to have the baseload generation there. Renewables are great. We're all for renewables. We've got renewables in our portfolio, and as you said, in Arkansas we've got a campaign called the Mix Matters, and it says you've got to have a mix of all of the above energy strategy, not all but one energy strategy. So renewables play a part. Certainly the wind renewables that we have, but it's not baseload generation. Fortunately, in Arkansas, we are part owners of the newest coal plant in the country, an ultra supercritical coal plant, the Turk plant, and we could not build another one today under today's EPA rules. So yes, we've got to have the baseload generation, or my people are out of power.
But these are such real issues with such dramatic impacts on people, and I really think the Obama administration is not being truthful with the American people when they set the emission standards on these new plants based on plants that will not be built without a lot of government support. And none of these plants are in full operation yet. That's the thing that's so disturbing to me and many other people. My time's expired, so I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I'm hearing this morning is a conflict between the legitimate desire to provide electric power to people in the world to make their lives better so they can live in a modern world, on the one hand, and on the other hand, providing electric power requires fossil fuels to be burned, which increases the problems associated with climate change. So the risk, in my opinion, of the climate change is the bigger risk, but we can't overlook the need to provide power. So that's the fine line that we need to develop and to walk. And to say that one side or the other is totally right or wrong is missing the point, in my opinion. Mr. Bywald, you had an interesting comment, I believe, in your opening statement that you thought that it was possible to provide responsible power and create jobs without increasing the price of electricity. Would you expand a little bit on that, please, in a minute or so?
Absolutely. In the states that we've looked at, it's perfectly plausible with a little bit of planning to retire some coal plants and replace them with alternatives that really don't cost any more. In fact, in many cases, cost less, and so it helps the consumers. We looked in Kentucky, for example. We did a study where adding efficiency in renewables, displacing some fossil fuels, added 20,000 net jobs by the year 2020. So it's sort of helping the economy. It's keeping the reserves at a level that is required for reliability and at reasonable cost to customers.
Would that increase the price of electricity for the customers?
It need not. What happens is the efficiency opportunities are so inexpensive and such low-hanging fruit and so attractive that those are available and decrease the prices a lot. The renewable prices are a mix. Some renewables are less than the conventional supply and some renewables are more. In terms of intermittent renewables coming on the grid, say wind, as Mr. Coleman points out, we need to serve baseload demand for electricity, but that baseload can be served by some mix of resources, including, say, wind with natural gas backing it up. So that provides, in combination, baseload power that serves that baseload demand reliability.
Thank you. Mr. O'Brien, I'd like you to sort of expand that discussion to the international situation. Well, how could we provide power to international customers that don't have power now using a responsible low-carbon emission method?
What's changed radically for us as a development organization is where the wealth that's driving economic growth is coming from. Let's take countries we've been in the last several decades. Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Mozambique. In the last 3 years, those 4 countries have discovered 130 trillion cubic feet of gas. They've discovered 2 billion barrels of oil. They don't need our help to burn more fossil fuels. In the same environment, they have populations facing extreme weather events all the time. They've got coastal regions where fishing communities are being wiped out. They've got farmers who are losing their livestock and their crops. What we are asking is that the United States plays a leadership role in helping the global economy move off an over-reliance. We want to be the ones associated with the hospital in Haiti that is able to run through solar power an entire hospital to cater for 6,000 patients. We want to be associated with that.
So another thing that scares me about climate change is the potential to drive political and military conflicts. Would you expand on that a little bit, please?
Today, there are 2 billion people under water stress. Many of them live in insecure regions where the governments don't have confident control of their territories, and they are not, frankly, anything close to the kind of strong democracies that we would like to see. Climate is only going to exacerbate local tensions based on lack of access to important resources like water and so on. If we don't tackle the consequences of climate change, we are going to be dealing with the stresses on governance and on security in much of the Sahel, in much of Central Asia, where I spent a lot of time, and in many of the other areas which are really facing water stress is perhaps the easiest way to understand it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You may have done this before I arrived, but we have former Congresswoman Joanne Emerson in the audience, and if she wasn't introduced, we welcome you back to the committee. We're glad to have you in your new position today.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. We hugged and kissed before, but we didn't do it publicly.
Well, I missed out on that, unfortunately. Dadgummit. We've been throwing around a lot of terms here today, Mr. Chairman, and just for the record, I'm I want to try to clarify some of these before I ask some policy questions. My first question, and I don't know who to ask this to. I guess the gentleman, the Utilities Commissioner from North Carolina, Mr. Finley, is the cost of CO2 the same as the cost of carbon?
Well, there's a lot of ways to measure the cost of carbon. Of course, carbon involves more than CO2. It involves methane and other types of gases. I'm no expert on the cost of carbon, so that's about the best answer I can give you.
Okay. Well, let me try it another way. When we talk about the cost of CO2, are we talking about the actual cost of obtaining CO2 for a productive purpose, such as oil field injection or something of that sort, or are we talking about the cost of complying with various CO2 remediation and reduction regulations?
In my opinion, it's the latter as opposed to the former. There's a lot of cost involved in taking the CO2 out of the smokestack and making the plants compliant with whatever regulations that we do come up with, and retrofitting plants to be able to accomplish.
So we're really talking about the cost of regulatory compliance.
I think that's a large cost.
Of CO2.
Yes.
Does anybody disagree with that? Anybody in the panel? I don't see.
Well, I think we're talking. Some people do talk about the cost of buying CO2 as an industrial product. That's really no one here today.
But that's not what your chart was.
No, and my chart has to do with the price of carbon or carbon dioxide for purposes of planning. So we're certainly talking about that. Some of us are also talking about the societal cost of the carbon emissions, so the cost of the damages associated with the carbon emissions. So there's both sides to it.
Which is a very subjective thing, very speculative. This pencil lead is carbon. I know what that costs. I know what this pencil costs. Your charts and all this, it's in the eye of the beholder what you want to apply to that. At least in my opinion, it is. So, do these compliance costs result in any increased efficiency in the generation of electricity or any lowering of electricity cost? I'll ask the gentleman from the electric co-op in northern Arkansas that question.
Again, Congressman, I'm a distribution guy. I'm not a generation guy, but would you restate the question for me one more time?
Well, I was trying to get you to say no. It just raises the cost.
That's what I heard, no.
Okay. That's the answer I wanted. I only have a minute left. The Vice President of Oxfam, I was really impressed by your testimony. I mean, you seem to be in the real world and not some starry-eyed idealist, which, you know, I'm an industrial engineer by training, so I really did appreciate what you said. So my question to you, and I don't think this is a loaded question, and I think the answer is going to be yes, but does your organization believe that democratically elected governments that use free market capitalism principles provide the greatest opportunity for their people to have a better life in their country?
Yes.
Okay, good.
We've a way to go to get there, but yes.
Okay. Now, I wish I had another 10 minutes or 5 minutes because I would really like to get into I actually support a lot of what you said about in these developing nations, a baseline power grid system like we have in the United States is not the most efficient means of providing power in these developing countries where they're so spread out and they don't have the infrastructure. And I do believe that alternative energy sources like wind power and in some cases small hydro is the way to go. But I also believe that there are cases where a baseload coal-fired power plant, if there is coal locally in the region, can provide an economy of scale and an efficiency that these alternative energy sources can't provide. So that, in my view, if you're using free market capitalism, you would have a mix in these developing countries. Would you agree to that's a pretty complicated statement?
I'll tell you what I saw.
And then I'll yield back to the...
And very briefly, in my 5 years in Afghanistan, I saw major infrastructure projects around energy start and flounder because the government was weak, like you say, or didn't have the capacity to get things going, or it got stolen, or there wasn't security on the ground to actually move the thing forward fast enough. But at the same time, I went to some of the most remote places and saw small micro-hydros literally change the options for women and children.
Right.
And I see what's going on in Pakistan today, and even if we get those lines across Afghanistan to provide power, I don't believe that government has what it takes to collect the revenues needed to sustain a big energy economy. That's why I think in many respects, if we want to meet real needs, we've got to go smaller and meet people where they're at.
I agree with that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired a long time ago, but this time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to do my questions within the 5 minutes, but I see that you're being liberal and allowing people to go over. But I'll try to stay within the 5 minutes. Coal-fired power plants are responsible for 1/3 of the nation's carbon dioxide pollution. A new coal-fired power plant can cost billions of dollars and might be expected to operate for 40 years or even longer. Given what we know about climate change, it doesn't make sense to invest in a new coal plant without considering the long-term liability of its pollution. Mr. Biewald testified that many electric utilities are looking for ways to minimize their carbon pollution, such as by including costs of carbon in their integrated resource plans, or IRPs. In 2013, the Arkansas Electric Cooperative, which supplies Mr. Coleman's co-op with its power, filed an IRP with the Arkansas Public Service Commission that included carbon price scenarios starting at $10 per ton in 2022 and escalating to as high as $78 per ton by 2050. Last year, Duke Energy Carolinas also included a carbon price in the IRP it filed with Chairman Finley's commission. Duke looked at a carbon price of $17 per ton beginning in 2020 and escalating over time. Mr. Coleman and Chairman Finley, are there laws that impose these carbon prices in Arkansas or North Carolina?
No.
Not in North Carolina.
No.
Not in North Carolina.
Okay. Jim Rogers, Duke Energy's former CEO, recently said, quote, "Every decision we make today, we make with the knowledge that there will be some day be carbon regulation in this country. There will be a price on carbon, and since we make decisions for 30, 40, and 60 years, we need to take that into account." Mr. Biewald, do you agree with Mr. Rogers that rational utilities should include a price on carbon in planning and investment decisions, even if there are no current laws that impose such a price?
Absolutely, yes. Because such prices are likely to be in place, policies and prices during the life of these assets. So prudent, responsible planning really requires the companies making these decisions to anticipate that. I would say
utilities around the country are prudently considering the cost of carbon in their business decisions. Unfortunately, there's only so much they can do on their own. In 2009, American Electric Power proposed to build a commercial-scale coal-fired power plant with carbon capture and sequestration in West Virginia. But AEP had to cancel that project when state regulators wouldn't approve the costs because no existing laws required AEP to reduce its carbon pollution. Mr. Biewald, are other utilities likely to be able to finance technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration if there are no legal requirements to control carbon?
I would say in general, no. It would be difficult for commissions to approve those kind of expenditures and put them on the backs of the customers. Even a new coal plant without carbon capture and sequestration is sort of economically unviable in the state. So it's not about the carbon, and in that regard, it's not about the carbon policy or the price of carbon. It's just the market economics of producing kilowatt hours.
Well, EPA's forthcoming power plant rules would provide the regulatory certainty utilities need to build cleaner coal plants in this country. Yet House Republicans recently passed the Whitfield bill out of this committee, which would block EPA's rules. House Republicans may not believe climate change is real, but virtually no one in the scientific community holds this position, and responsible businesses don't either. This committee needs to stop ignoring reality and start finding solutions to climate change. In his questions a minute ago or so, Chairman Whitfield read some out-of-context quotes that suggest that climate change has paused and that there is less reason for concern. He could not be more wrong. Yesterday, the Royal Society of Great Britain and our own National Academy of Sciences published a new paper entitled, quote, Climate Change, Evidence and Causes, end quote, that specifically addresses these and similar denialist arguments. And let me read you a key section. Quote, does the recent slowdown of warming mean that climate change is no longer happening, question mark, end quote? No. Despite the slower rate of warming, the 2000s were warmer than the 1990s. A short-term slowdown in the warming of the Earth's surface does not invalidate our understanding of long-term changes in global temperature arising from human-induced changes in greenhouse gases, end quote. So since there's still such misunderstanding about such basic facts on this committee, I'd ask unanimous consent to introduce this report for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see that my time has expired.
Thank you. And at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for the hearing today, and thanks for our witnesses for being with us today. Greatly appreciate your testimony. You know, we have been experiencing a really cold winter in the United States. Across my district, tonight's going to be 10 below again. So it's been cold. But if I could get right to it, just a little bit about my district. I probably represent the largest number of co-ops in the state of Ohio. I probably represent the largest number of farmers in the state of Ohio. I also represent about 60,000 manufacturing jobs in the state of Ohio. And as I believe Mr. Coleman had said a little bit earlier, that you need baseload capacity to turn these machines on, what you need to do to power up. And that's what we have to have in my area, to make sure that people are back at their jobs in the morning working. And if I could, Mr. Finley, I noticed with interest on page 4 of your testimony, you're describing you know, some of the declines in your furniture businesses and things like that. And on page 5 that you know, you're out competing for business across the country, and businesses are out there looking at price and reliability. How important is it to you to have that power out there to make sure that you can bring businesses into your state?
It's fundamentally important. It's one of the most important aspects of our jobs and the power companies' jobs that we regulate.
And Mr. Coleman, as you talk about Arkansas co-ops, and you know, I also saw that in your testimony, you know, you talked about that you wanted, if you're going to raise the standard of living and tackle poverty, you've got to have that power. And to be able to do that, especially tackling poverty, and to have that power, doesn't that equate to jobs that you have to have? To make
Absolutely.
Sure that you have it? And when you look at, and again, in looking at your testimony, I also found it interesting, I think it was on page 2 of your testimony, where you went into one of your plants is required to do $614 million in total upgrades to a plant that costs $1.17 billion. So you're almost at half the cost of your plant for upgrades. Who's paying for those costs?
Congressman, my members are, and all of the 480,000 members of the state of Arkansas are paying for those in the electric bills every day.
Okay, and when you look at that, what are your folks out there that are using the power in your companies are saying when they're getting these increases in their costs? Are they saying that they can stay in Arkansas, or do they have to sometimes look somewhere else?
I can give you an example. We've got a 10-megawatt load on our lines, and we meet with them on a quarterly basis. They're based out of Chicago and they're the largest user of power that we have. Power is also the largest expense that they have as a business. And, I meet with them across the table once a year, and I hear from them that, when is this going to end? And if you listen to some of the testimony today, it's not when is it going to end. It's almost like it's just beginning. So when we talk to whether it's the industrial customer or whether I talk across the table to a residential member, and I've got some stories about how they can't pay their bills, that's the problem, the affordability of the bill and the fact that the power has got to be there when they need it.
Thank you. Mr. Finley, if I could ask a question of you now. You also testified that the electricity rate increases are up in North Carolina are being driven largely by recent construction of power plants required in large measure by need to comply with more stringent environmental regulations. When you refer to more stringent environmental regulations, what are you referring to?
Those have to do with the atmospheric regulations, both within our state and from the national government. There are any number of them that have been driving the cost of plants in North Carolina since approximately 2002.
Thank you. And Mr. Moss, also when you're looking at the developing countries out there and to really get their economies moving and get the standard of living up there, you have to have jobs. And to have those jobs, you have to have that energy, and especially on electricity. When you look into that crystal ball into the future, what kind of power do these countries have to be able to have that baseload capacity to create those jobs to increase that standard of living?
Many multiples of what they have now. Many, many multiples.
Okay, and when you say multiples, and how would you describe the multiples?
The average person in Nigeria uses about 130 kilowatt hours per year. In the United States, average person uses about 13,000. So we've got a 100-fold, for a Nigerian that wants to live an American-style lifestyle, they need a 100-fold increase in power. There's an aluminum smelter previously owned by an American company in Ghana. That's been running at only 20% capacity for the sole reason that they do not have enough power.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time, recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our panelists for some interesting discussion. Mr. O'Brien, in your testimony, you referred to the International Energy Agency's scenario for universal energy access, which has 65% of the energy coming from renewable sources. The model for the electricity sector in the developed world, large-scale central generation with power delivered to customers over a network of transmission and electrical lines, is about a century old. OPIX and the Exim Bank have been operating for years without any energy cap, and these countries have had access to the technologies that make up this traditional generation and delivery system for years. This model hasn't delivered for these people, so this doesn't seem to be a realistic model for energy access by the poor, especially in rural areas. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes.
And the finance model for our electricity sector, where central generation and delivery costs are paid by the ratepayers, also doesn't seem realistic for people who operate in a cash or barter economy and spend about 75% of their incomes on food. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
It seems to me that analogies to the situation with, or analogous to the situation with landline-based telecommunications versus cellular communication, that the improvements in renewable energy technologies and the drop in the price to acquire them seems to have been done far more to improve energy access for poor people in developing countries than our decades-long attempt to help them duplicate our model of energy access. Is that?
Yeah, I had the privilege of being in both Africa and Afghanistan to watch the technology leap in the telecom sector, and it was transformative, and it wasn't done by starting from old technologies. I couldn't agree with you more.
Thank you. And your testimony provides examples of climate impacts that poor communities in the developing nations are experiencing now. Are these communities or their national governments able to respond to natural disasters, increased water scarcity, or other climate-related problems that they are experiencing?
The short answer is they have to be, because there's no other viable way to meet the long-term solutions. If we want those free market economies with proper oversight, you've got to have effective governments doing that. When we went into Haiti to help them after the earthquake, only 1% of all the money we provided to Haiti went through public institutions and basically left them just as weak afterwards as they were beforehand. You know that Haiti is going to see another climate-related disaster in the next few years, and their government is no more ready than it was today. It's no more ready today than it was before the last crisis. We've got to find a way both to meet the needs of people on the ground and to do it in a way that makes local institutions stronger at being responsible themselves.
Thank you. And what do these continued or accelerated climate impacts mean for the people affected?
Well, it means everything. It means jobs, too, for fishermen, for farmers, for healthcare workers. We are witnessing threats to livelihood in all of these contexts because of extreme weather events. And that's why we're so seized with the fact that we have to address both the climate challenges economically and the energy challenges.
Mr. Chair, thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. This time I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Brien, in your testimony, you used quite a few statistics and some facts there, but you didn't provide the sources of those so that we could verify that. Things on page 3, you talk about the 20-time, you use a 20-time multiplier. You talked about the 3% with the poorest people. They're just serious. Could you go back through your testimony and provide us the references of those, if you would, please?
We'll be happy to do that.
But that leads me to another, because what I heard in your comments, you raised a very interesting, quite frankly, a moral question. I think everyone on the panel and others would agree that the African nation needs affordable and dependable energy for them to emerge from poverty. And there's a consensus among economists that the best way to do that is using their fossil fuels that either they have or they can develop with that. But by virtue of some of your testimony, it came across that these Africans and other people in third world nations shouldn't be, it comes across as they shouldn't be entitled to use them. Now, America can, but they can't. And so there was a quote that was given. It was, forcing a third world person to stay behind by forcing him to use more expensive electricity just so some first world person will feel better about themselves. This comes across as immoral, and I'm troubled with that. And I hope that we can work together somehow to get across it, maybe change the minds of some individuals with that. But at the time that I have remaining, I'd like to hear a little bit of Mr. Moss, because you were also providing some very interesting testimony. I started talking about Africa a year ago, the problems that they have with the lack of power and how we can be exporting coal into Africa to develop so that they can emerge from poverty. And I used the model of a 60-watt light bulb. And I said, that's the total power that they have there is a 60-watt light bulb for 3 hours a day per person. That's it. So I want you to amplify a little bit more on that and also to reflect back on some of Mr. O'Brien's testimony, if you would, please.
Sure. I mean, I think that it's absolutely right that the poorest people in the world are going to be hit the hardest by climate change. But it's perverse to actually make the world's poor pay twice by compounding their poverty by taking measures that effectively deny them access to power. There is no plausible scenario that I have ever seen where African carbon emissions are going to affect global emissions. So if it's a global problem, the problem is in the current emitting countries. It's not, us denying Ghana 2 or 3 natural gas power plants is going to have absolutely zero effect globally. So it doesn't make sense to try to connect Ghanaian farmers who are having trouble with climate change and saying, well, let's not let Ghanaian farmers get electricity from Ghana's natural gas. That just is a logical leap that I think is, quite frankly, quite immoral. Just one other point I want to make. The IEA figures, the International Energy Agency, when they define energy access, it's for an urban household of 5 people, 500 kilowatt hours per year. That's 100 kilowatt hours per person. That is what an American will use in 3 days. So when you see these scenarios that we can provide universal energy access through nice solar panels. Yes, some clinics will run on solar panels. Yes, microhydro and other technologies are changing every day. But if your target is 3 days worth of electricity per year for somebody, of course you can do it through these other technologies. And you're not going to be able to build industry. You're not going to be able to have households that run refrigerators and washing machines and all of the things that all consumers want without being able to provide a modern energy system, which, given current economics, frankly, is going to have to be a mix, including a lot of fossil fuels in many places. And it's true that the prices of renewable technology is coming down. If it turns out that renewables are cheaper in Ghana or Kenya or Mozambique, then the regulations on something like OPIC are totally irrelevant, because OPIC is going to decide project by project on what is commercially viable. That's how they do it. So.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to the panel. I think this is a very interesting topic, and we have many challenges ahead. Affordable, reliable electricity is very important to our neighbors back home and to the overall economy. And one way that states and utilities help ensure that electricity costs are affordable is by going through planning processes routinely, where they look at the economics of generation and conservation over the long term and then compare different options. And I know you all agree that if utilities do not adequately prepare for the future, this can impose substantial cost on the electricity system and its customers. But it seems now that these planning processes now do not meet the challenges that we face due to the changing climate. They seem divorced from the context of rising costs from extreme events. I know one of my colleagues said that those costs are often subjective, but they're real when local governments have to adapt, have to address rising sea level rise, put in our local property tax dollars to repair or replace infrastructure systems at home, and look at what the Congress has to do when it comes to disaster funding, responding to natural disasters. It has been a very high price tag that is very well documented. It seems that part of this is because the whole business model of electricity sales is outdated. There need to be new incentives for the utilities to promote conservation and energy efficiency. And some states are doing that and some are way behind. My state of Florida is kind of a problem child and needs to do more when it comes to efficiency and conservation. Mr. Bewald, you know, your group has done a lot of the analysis on these planning processes. Most state electric utility planning processes really don't take into account the wider range of costs. One Florida utility commissioner recently said to me in a conversation, gosh, our hands are tied. The state law was written some time ago. We can't consider any of these cost factors outside of just that narrow ratepayer or rate increase decision. What needs to happen today in the planning processes at the state level for states to begin to build in consideration of the huge costs that we're going to face in the future due to the changing climate?
So I start by pointing out Florida is one of the more vulnerable states in terms of those damages, right? The storms and the impacts of climate change. We tallied up the damages and for scenarios with sea level rise in Florida, and they are, I'll say, astronomical. In terms of the regulation of utilities in Florida, I think that the regulators in many states, you have to look state by state, but in many states they have more leeway than they take advantage of. In other words, regulators should certainly be requiring best practices in integrated resource planning, and those practices including a carbon price or carbon constraint on the planning of the utilities as they're picking their resources, and looking at a full range of resource options, really looking at energy efficiency, really looking at renewables. Some states now have laws that require the procurement of all cost-effective energy efficiency. And that's a terrific thing. It's basically in the interest of the customers and the businesses in that state. Has environmental benefits, but also economic benefits locally. So where we see things like that happening, it helps the commissions
but do you
and
agree,
the utilities.
Do you agree this whole business model on the amount of energy you sell the really is not going to serve us well in the future? Think about the cost that ratepayers and consumers could realize if utilities are aggressive about conservation and energy efficiency. And there's one huge example out of Florida, I know you all are aware of it, where we've put in an advanced recovery fee that kind of encourages the building of large power plants. Unfortunately, the plants did not come online, but the ratepayers were still on the hook to the tune of $3 billion without realizing 1 kilowatt hour of energy. Certainly, if a more enlightened business decision had been made, that $3 billion could go to more energy efficient initiatives. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of improvement that can be made within the current legal and regulatory structures. And then also the utility business model and the regulated monopoly regulation, the way it's done, is very stressed and needs to change. I think that will be changed going forward on a kind of state-by-state basis as states experiment.
What can we do at the federal level to encourage it?
Well, at the federal level, I think the main thing is clarity of the coming regulations. So in other words, utilities in these planning processes in the states, some of them do a good job at anticipating the future fossil fuel prices, future environmental regulations of various types. Other utilities take a very myopic view. They look at the next regulation and ignore the further regulations that are going to come 4 years, 6 years from now. So as regulations are firmed up, so there's some certainty of what's actually coming in terms of carbon and cooling water and air regulations, that helps the utilities and the regulators be able to plan in a rational way and actually pick the lower cost alternatives. What no one wants is this piecemealing of complying with just the next regulation, then the next regulation, then the next regulation, one at a time, which leads to horrendous resource decisions, very expensive investments, as you pointed out, that hurt the residential customers, hurts the industrial customers, hurts the local economy.
Gentlelady's time has expired. This time I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We heard from some folks on the other side today that Republicans aren't interested in solutions. What we're really interested in is that the EPA has proposed solutions that simply don't work. I asked Ms. McCarthy a few weeks back now about the 26 indicators she's got on her website, on the EPA website, about climate change. And I asked what the greenhouse gas regulations would do to each of those 26 indicators. And she said, well, you're thinking about it wrong. This is about global leadership. This is about actually impacting climate change. This is about feeling good about ourselves. Science, we've been challenged that Republicans don't care about science. Science is about testable propositions, right? You set a set of regulations, you say this is the impact we would expect this would have on climate change, and then you test against that. And yet the very test that's being proposed by the EPA, the administrator herself admits, doesn't work. And so I think this is all about science. I think it's about finding real good solutions that work. And Mr. Coleman, that's why I wanted to ask you a question. So you talked about we've got a greenhouse gas set of rules that are proposed for future coal power plants to be built, and you expressed some concern that they may begin to regulate current coal-fired power plant generation as well. How long before the impact of just the rules on new power plants will begin to be felt in the cost structure?
Well, I think you're feeling them right now. I was fortunate enough to be able to speak to the EPA back in the summer about this. We're seeing and we're projecting rates that are going to be again somewhere around 40%, 20 to 40% range for our members when we see some of these come into effect. Now, that's up to $480 a year, and that's not a lot to us, but to the ladies, the grandmothers that I've got on fixed incomes, when you talk about these coal-fired plants, whether it's the existing fleet or whether it's the new fleet, it's going to have a tremendous negative impact on my members. And I can give you one example. I had a grandmother call me a few years back when we have a fuel cost line adder on our bill, and as fuel costs rise, that is passed along to the member because that's the only person that can pay these fuel costs. But I had a grandmother from Horseshoe Bend, Arkansas, called me. Typically, this would be a phone call where she was not happy and I might get chewed on just a little bit. But she told me, she said, I want you to know that I have figured out. I got this phone call, by the way. This is not someone handing me a note. She said, I want you to know that I have figured out how to pay my electric bill. I'm going to take my medication every other day. This was several years back. That was when that lady's electric bill was lower than it is today. And what really scares me is all this stuff we're talking about. How's she going to afford it? I got a text last night from a member who cannot pay her electric bill, and she's a young person. And she's worried about not being able to afford air conditioning in the summer because of what her winter bills have been because of the extreme winter. This is what I face every day.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Real health effects of these regulations impacting folks adversely, as opposed to what the proponents of these rules would say they're going to improve the health of citizens in Arkansas and places like South Central Kansas.
Exactly.
Thank you. Mr. Buell, you said in your testimony that in a strip, South Dakota and south, that'd be Kansas, straight south of South Dakota. If I got my geography right. You said wind is cheaper than other forms of energy today. Is that testimony?
In many parts of the country, yes.
So if it's cheaper today, no need for the wind production tax credit any longer? That's a vestige of days gone by, an anachronism, because we now have affordable wind energy, at least in this strip. We'll have it in other places, but the production tax credit for producers in those places we should just eliminate immediately. That makes sense, right? Just let the market sort out because they're cheaper today.
I think we should look at energy subsidies kind of comprehensively.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I'm going to ask the question. One of the justifications for the wind production tax credit is you have to subsidize it while the technology improves so the costs could come down. And I just heard you say we're there.
I think there are parts of the country where that is the case for wind. There are other
Great.
parts
I thank you for supporting me in that effort to get rid of all of those energy tax credits. For the oil and gas guys, too, I think we should get rid of them all. But it sounds like wind is at the competitive point from your perspective in at least certain places. I was also interested, I've just got 20 seconds left. You talked about companies pricing carbon today in anticipation of regulations down the road. So just the mere threat of regulation is driving up cost for consumers today. Is that right?
Not at all. It's providing a signal where the smart utilities that are looking forward, doing long-term planning, are able to make better resource decisions. I would say it's lowering costs, and again, in many parts of the country.
Wow. How about that? So it's lowering costs for them to anticipate some future cost increase on their business. That's, having been a small businessman for a long time, that is fascinating economics.
I also am a small businessman.
Yeah.
And we try to do good planning.
Fascinating. I'll yield back.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearing. Today's hearing, we're discussing the topic of electricity production and climate change. We've heard from our witnesses that discuss domestic and international opportunities and challenges associated with energy access. But underlying all these opportunities and challenges is the economic cost. Now, the cost associated with natural resources, regulation, production, carbon, has created vast amounts of uncertainty for consumers, investors, industry, and the environment. And it is this uncertainty that Congress should address. We must create a workable structure that deals with uncertainty, and the framework must remove these unknown variables and address environmental concerns and promote economic development. With saying all that, I have some questions. Mr. Buell, your organization produced a document, 2013 carbon dioxide price forecast, that discusses a number of different ways to price carbon. Under the social cost of carbon, the price of carbon is $23 to $37. Industry internally priced carbon at $6 to $60, which is a great spread. And regional cap and trade prices range from $2 to $11. First, what accounts for these wide disparities? Are they all using different formulas?
Well, they're to some extent different things. And one of the questions I answered earlier had to do with the price of carbon in terms of compliance versus the social cost of carbon. Mm-hmm. So the social cost, those higher numbers are associated with the damages imposed on people outside of the system from the emissions. The medium numbers, I believe that you referred to, have to do typically with the cost of compliance, so the marginal price. If you had a cap and trade system comprehensive for the country, this is where the price might be, the kind of prices that I showed where utilities are anticipating the cost. And then the lower numbers are for some of the cap and trade systems in place today.
Okay. I represent a very industrial district in Houston, refineries, chemical plants, and I know the issue with EPA now is looking at new power generation plants. We know the carbon emitted from a coal plant, and in Texas we use everything, coal, natural gas. I don't think we use fuel oil, but a lot of our rural areas we use propane. But on the cost of fuel switching is a good example. And I want to ask from our co-op in Arkansas, because of your baseline base fuel is coal, and I know Arkansas traditionally has produced natural gas, and we're seeing some very low prices, except for the last month when we've had such, although my producers obviously like the $5 or $6, but we don't think it'll stay there. What would be the carbon cost, for example, if you used your base load in Arkansas, used natural gas instead of coal? What would it cost? Is coal that much cheaper than a pipeline from, say, South Texas to be able to fuel switch to natural gas?
Yes, sir. Coal is our least cost resource. The existing coal fleet that we have, when you exclude the Turk plant that you're well aware of, is about 2.3, 2.4 cents. You get up in the gas range, you're going to be up in that 4 cents kilowatt hour on the wholesale basis. Now, again, my disclaimer here is I'm a distribution guy, but obviously I keep up with our generation resources. But yes, natural gas is more expensive. And what worries me is what happens when the next debate moves on to natural gas because of its carbon emissions.
Well, and that's the issue, but unless scientists are changing their opinions, we know carbon would be about half what it would be for coal. But somewhere along the way, that's where I get back to the cost. You know, the ratepayer is going to end up paying for that cost.
Yes,
now, if we see, people really do want to deal with carbon, then we need to make sure that the ratepayers understand there's a cost to doing that. And although I have to admit, in Texas, we also produce more wind power than everywhere else in the country. And it is cheap. In fact, even ERCOT in our recent problem with reliability said if we hadn't had that 10,000 megawatts of wind power, we would have probably had rolling blackouts through Texas. And if in Texas we're lacking energy, electricity production, no telling what the rest of the country is, because we use, like I said, everything except for hydropower. We just don't have enough rivers that have any fall to be able to deal with hydropower. Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of my time, but I appreciate because that's the issue, the cost and how much both our customers, your grandmother, but also your industry in Arkansas can afford to be there. And with natural gas, we're seeing expansion of a lot of plant capacity simply because it is cheaper. Thank you.
Thank you. And this time, recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Ken. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was in microphone no man's land, so I'll move here. I appreciate you bringing this hearing together in order to focus on the benefits of having access to affordable and reliable electricity. Not only do individual households reap the benefit of our country's vast energy resources on a daily basis, but so does our economy. The industrial sector in the United States accounts for about 1/3 of all end-use energy consumption, while filling about 14% of our GDP. What this means is that access to our country's affordable and reliable energy puts domestic production and employment in the manufacturing industry at a competitive advantage as compared to others around the world. In fact, I had an interesting meeting recently in Germany in which many of the German CEOs informed me of that very fact and the much better competitive environment here in the United States than even in Europe. Lower input prices tend to lead to higher output that can in turn lower prices for consumers. Lower prices lead to less demand for imported products and help create jobs domestically, which are all good things. In Illinois, over 90% of our electricity generation comes from nuclear and coal power plants, which seem to both be under constant regulatory threats to their existence. In my district alone, I have 4 nuclear power plants providing grid and price stability to consumers throughout our region. I believe I have the most of any congressman out there. Without the availability of this baseload power, there's no doubt that energy prices would skyrocket and the stability of the energy grid would plummet. Not only would this be bad for households, but it also creates an environment in which manufacturers will have to deal with yet another hurdle in order to compete on a global market. Unfortunately, as is often the case, government regulations have put up roadblocks to this sector of the energy industry. In just the past 5 years, 5 nuclear power plants have either retired or announced their plans to retire in the near future. And that's baseload power that's critical to the reliability of the system that, unlike some other forms of power generation, we can't just flip a switch to turn back on. In addition to this, a large portion of nuclear industry is getting to the end of their current licensing lifespans. As it currently stands, existing operating licenses for over 7,500 megawatts of capacity are scheduled to expire before 2023. 2 of those reactors are in my district in Illinois. This threat of closure due to relicensing requirements is real and is something that I believe we should all take very seriously. The Foreign Affairs Committee, which I also sit on, just held a markup on the Electrify Africa Act, and I believe Dr. Moss mentioned that in his opening statement. It's bipartisan legislation that states it is U.S. policy to encourage access to electricity through the development of a multi-year strategy to assist countries throughout that region. I actually recently visited Liberia, and I saw the stark contrast between those in Liberia and how they live and those in the United States. And because it was a country that chewed itself up with civil war, you have basically a lost generation, a lost decade. And in many cases, though I think there's hope for Liberia in the future, it's sometimes hard to find because of what happened. So Dr. Moss, my first question is for you. What's a level of electricity that we would consider meaningful access for the poor in Africa and other nations? And is it enough to power a few light bulbs for each person through the year, or to provide such necessary for people to have refrigeration, sanitation, efficient water delivery, things like that?
Yeah, I think, the international standard of 100 kilowatt hours per year, or in rural areas 50 kilowatt hours per year, it's way too low. It's kind of the equivalent of the international standard for poverty of $1 a day. If you got everybody up to $1.50 a day, you wouldn't call them rich, and they certainly wouldn't be satisfied with that income. The exact level, probably something closer to 4,000, 5,000 kilowatt hours per year would be a better international standard that would be, would provide a dignified and dignified life that people could use the appliances that in Europe, United States, and other developed parts of the world that we take for granted.
Well, thanks. And I think it's interesting, too, if you actually look at the advances that Africa has made. I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, we were constantly seeing videos of people on the edge of starvation. And that number of people on the edge of starvation has reduced, but we still have a huge poverty problem, obviously, in Africa. And when you deny people energy, you deny them opportunity to be entrepreneurs, to build businesses, and to grow themselves out of that situation. How far do we have to go to get to a point where the poorest of Africa have access on the order of, say, Great Britain or China? Obviously,
I don't want to look into a crystal ball on that. I would say that there's decades of investment that have to come, and it's both at the consumer level for individuals. And I should add that the analogy to cell phones, of being able to leapfrog cell phones, I actually, until we can project electricity through the air, the actual lesson from cell phones is that you can create a commercial, the commerce can be based on mobile phone payment systems. I was not that long ago in Namibia, and they have a pay-as-you-go scratch card for electricity. And that being able to do that allows poor people to pay for their electricity, which is necessary for commercial sustainability. And we've seen from cell phones that even poor people are willing to pay for services if they work. So I think there's a lot of potential there.
Thank you. And as I wrap up, I'll just say, I think developing the electrical grid in Africa is important to help them withstand weather disasters, to reduce the need for U.S. and foreign aid, and obviously help us to live in a much better, peaceful world. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and welcome to our witnesses. On January 10th of 1901, the Spindletop well near Beaumont, Texas, started gushing oil. My home state, Texas, rightfully became the face of oil in America. But a century later, that face has changed. We're still the face of oil, we're the face of coal, the face of natural gas, the face of nuclear power, the face of solar power, the face of wind power. As my colleague Gene Green mentioned, we're the #1 wind producer in America right now. We have a true diversified energy portfolio, which has allowed our state, my state, to become the fastest growing state in the country. 3 million people moved to Texas between 2000 and 2010. But that growth is being threatened. The administration is conducting a war on coal. Nuclear power here in America is on hold. And tax credits for wind are putting our baseload power under pressure. Our grid's reliability is uncertain in the future in many ways. My first question is for you, Mr. Coleman. And I know that Arkansas is different from Texas, but can you please go into more detail on why wind is an important source, but not one that we can build a grid around?
And you said wind, sir?
Wind, sir, yes, sir. Again, we're #1, but we can't build a grid around that.
Well, we can't build a grid around anything, in my opinion, except baseload generation. We do have wind assets, and when the wind blows, we have those assets, the peaking power that they provide. But I am unable to meet the obligation that I have to serve my members if Arkansas Electric Cooperative has to base their portfolio around wind. We have to have the baseload generation. If I've learned anything in the last few months, Lord hope I have learned something, because we've had a tough winter in Arkansas. I don't know how Texas has been, but Arkansas has had a tough winter. We've got more to come. But our baseload coal generation is our hedge against the volatilities that we see of natural gas, of the ineffectiveness of wind and solar. But we cannot, as you said, base our portfolio around wind technology. We'll utilize it. It'll be part of the mix. The mix does matter, and it's an all-of-the-above strategy, just as you mentioned Texas has.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Next question for you, Dr. Moss. And first of all, having a 13-year-old son who'll be 14 in April, your boy is amazing. But I know he's getting very hungry right now, so my questions will be very brief. I want to talk about India. As you know, over 1 billion people call India home. Over 400 million live in poverty, no electricity. That's more than the entire population of America. And I saw this firsthand. I went on a trip before Christmas. Wealth and poverty, opulence next to staggering poverty, right side by side. You said that allowing OPEC to invest in gas plants would bring electricity to 60 million more people focused on renewables alone, without folks. Let me get this straight. You said that allowing OPEC to invest in gas plants would bring electricity to 60 million more people than focusing on renewables alone. And while Chairman Emeritus Dingell is leaving us, his examples persist. I'll ask you some yes or no questions and get your son to have his lunch here. Are those 6 million people more likely to face illness and see higher child mortality, more deaths? Those 60 million people without getting that power? More? Yes or no?
Sorry, without getting power?
Yes. Yes, okay. Yes or no? Are they more likely to remain on crude sources of heat and power than dirtier and inefficient sources? Yes. are they more likely to stay in severe poverty? Do you believe that, regarding India, is there any downside to exporting LNG, liquefied natural gas, to India, in your opinion? Downside for the United States, India, anybody in the world? Big picture. No downside. One final question. Do you believe that current American policies on power in the developing world would leave people in the dark who would otherwise see electrification? And you can elaborate on that one.
Yes, it will. I mean, it depends a lot what happens with the next, a lot of the regulations were changing the FY14 appropriations bill, so it'll depend a lot what happens next year.
Okay, that's all my questions. It's time for lunch.
Enjoy your lunch, Mr. Olson. This time, I'd like to recognize a gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
He thought he was last. He forgot about me. Thank you all for being here. This is important. I will tell you that several years ago, then Administrator of the EPA, Lisa Jackson, was in. We were debating the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. Obviously, the case of Massachusetts versus EPA set up the principle that they could. It didn't say that they had to. It just said they could if they found that it was harmful from a health standpoint. I asked her at that time, I said, okay, your testimony here today, I was last then also. Your testimony here today has all been about global warming and how hotter temperatures cause people to have more heart attacks and strokes. But what happens when somebody like people in my district cannot afford to pay their bill, cannot afford to buy their fuel? The cost has gone up too high for their electricity and they cannot heat their home in the wintertime. Did you all study that? I asked her that question. Her response to me at that time was, and I may be paraphrasing, but pretty darn close, was, we have programs to take care of those people. Mr. Coleman and Chairman Finley, I ask you, when you hear these stories of people who are not taking their medications, or you hear stories of people who can't pay their bill, are there always programs to take care of those people, or does the money run out like it sometimes does in my district in a hard winter by the time you get to the end of February?
The money runs out.
Chairman Finley?
We do the best we can to have support for people who can't pay, but for many there is not enough money there.
And so, I have to question the underlying finding by the EPA that they have the authority to regulate these greenhouse gases because they studied one half of the problem, the rising temperature, but they never looked at what happens when you make those costs go up for the poor people in our country, for the working folks, for the middle class. I think your testimony, and I apologize, I wasn't here, I was at another hearing, but one of you, I think, testified that your constituents or the people that you serve, I guess it was you, Mr. Coleman, have an average household income of about $32,000. My district might be a couple $1,000s different than yours, but I'm in the same boat with the people that I represent, and they can't always afford to pay these things. We didn't look at that. We didn't look at, apparently, what happens when people can't afford to pay for their medication and to heat their homes. And so, as a result of that, I think that the policies the EPA is putting forward are actually harming the health of a lot of American citizens, and it's unfortunate they didn't take the whole picture into account. And the testimony today here, hearing you all testify and knowing that your testimony is heart-wrenching, I understand that because my constituents tell me the same thing. Let's talk about, Mr. Coleman, you said the volatility of natural gas. This winter, there have been a lot of places. Did you all have any difficulty getting hold of the natural gas necessary to power whatever plants you have using natural gas?
We didn't have any difficulty, but at one time, some of the prices that we saw, we were in the $3 to $4 range. We saw prices $17, $18 that spiked. Prices on average were $4 or $5.
Yeah, and I saw reports that in the Northeast where they were having trouble getting the supply, that prices actually crested over $100 during that really bad cold snap. That doesn't happen, obviously, with coal. You got it piled up out back. You can just pull it in there. It is there. We do have some infrastructure issues with turning it all over to natural gas. Now, in my area, I heard one of the other witnesses or one of the other congressmen say that they didn't use a lot of fuel oil in their area, but in my area, a lot of people use fuel oil, and we do at my house. And one of the reasons we use fuel oil because we kind of like to switch to natural gas. But there's no pipe that comes to our house. I live just on the other side of the interstate. And it's just too costly to bring that pipe across the Interstate 81 to my neighborhood, so I don't have the ability to get natural gas. Might be able to get propane. Do you find that to be a problem for some of the folks in North Carolina, Chairman Finley?
Yes, sir, it is a problem. We've done a good job, I think, in expanding the pipeline facility. 12 years ago, I was in your situation in the middle of Raleigh. My old 40-year-old furnace, oil furnace, went out in the coldest day of the winter, and the pipeline was about 20 yards up the street. And they couldn't get it there for 3 weeks, and I couldn't wait for 3 weeks, so I had to put an oil furnace back in.
Yep. And so this is a problem that real people, not ivory tower folks at the EPA or even in the halls of Congress, are facing. It's that, you know, natural gas might be the wave of the future, but if you can't get it there, if you don't have the supplies to provide the electricity, to provide the heat for people, they're going to need it. And also the fact that we're raising the cost by creating regulations that are closing down plants and raising the cost of electricity for the average American citizen is harmful to the health of the working people in this country. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to have this hearing, and I yield back.
I would say, if I might, that from our friends at PSNC, that they have run the line down to my house, and I do have natural gas now.
You're chairman, so you've got influence, right? Well, Mr. Griffin, thank you, and I want to thank you all for coming this morning to testify. We appreciate the insights that all of you provided on a rather vexing issue. And that will conclude the hearing. I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the Electric Reliability Coordinating Council's document entitled What the Cold Snap Tells Us About EPA Carbon Rules, as well as a letter we received from the CEOs of 5 nuclear power plants. A letter from the CEOs to the EPA relating to EPA's pending cooling tower rules and the fact that that may cause the premature retirement of a significant portion of the nuclear fleet. And then I want to clarify the fact that when I was talking about Southern Company, I want to make sure that I said 75% of Southern Company's coal-fired generating plants scheduled to be retired were operated during the cold spell, and that's like 3,300 megawatts. So those that were scheduled to be retired were operating, and certainly when they're retired, that'll be the end of it. And also ask unanimous consent that we enter into the record energy access and the true cost of fossil fuel projects in Africa. So with that, the record will remain open for 10 days, and we look forward to working with all of you as we move forward, and thank you again for your time. And that will conclude today's hearing.